title, China's Reinvention of Money and the End of America's Domination of Finance and Technology by Martin Chorzempa. Martin is a special person along many lines, and it is a particular source of pride and joy for all of us at the Institute to be celebrating the launch of his first book. I won't get maudlin because what matters is the book is very good. Martin does an amazing job of pulling together narrative, facts, analysis, comparison, and finally policy implications. In a world where China's rise economically in security terms, in political terms, even if seemingly shaky, has dominated the discussions in Washington and throughout the world, and in which, in particular, their fear of their developments in technology, in finance, in information processing, has contributed to a host of reactions in markets and around the world, and most of all for the Chinese people. It is very fortunate that not just we at the Peterson Institute, but we all in the general public have Martin to guide us through making some sense of this. I will formally introduce Martin in a moment, but I will just say further, I had the pleasure to meet Martin for the first time when he was working for and with the CF40, which is our preferred partner think tank in China, the leading independent economics think tank in China. He was at that time merely a student who ran around interpreting, both in the sense of translating, but also guiding a group of us Peterson Fellows on one of our annual trips to China we used to do. And I'll give myself a little credit, I saw the potential there. So Martin and I kept in contact through his graduate work, and we brought him to the Peterson Institute. And he has been a wonderful colleague, rapidly rising figure in discussions of economic policy along two orthogonal dimensions, on China issues and on issues of technology and governance. And that makes him a double threat. His ability to be quotable without being misleading in the major press makes him a triple threat. And it is something obviously we value greatly. I also get a little maudlin flashing back to 25 years ago, not exactly in this space, but in the equivalent at the Peterson Institute, when I published my first book, and Fred Bergston was kind enough to introduce me to an unsuspecting world. In today's social media, and given Martin's precociousness, the world is not unsuspecting about Martin, but they will know more about him and the cashless revolution he describes and analyzes very soon. Just to fill in the blanks, Martin has been with us at the Peterson Institute since 2017. He was made a senior fellow a year ago, January. He gained expertise in financial innovation, working internationally in Germany as a Fulbright scholar at the Association of German Banks. As previously mentioned, he worked in China, in Beijing for several years, including as a Luce Scholar at Peking University's China Center for Economic Research, and then at the China Finance 40 Forum. In 2017, he graduated from the Harvard Kennedy School with a master's in public administration and international development, which everyone in the know knows is the higher quant tech version of the Kennedy School degree. The show is going to be good. Please tell your friends, please distribute the video, please buy the book. With that, Martin, over to you.
So thank you so much, Adam, not only for the kind introduction, but for the many years of mentorship and support which helped make this book a reality. I'd like to thank also some of the people in the room, you know who you are, who I inflicted earlier drafts of this on, and I'm hoping that the PPT shows up at some point while I'm going here. This book was 8 years in the making, and its origins came from my time in China. I moved to China in the middle of 2013, at a time when its financial system was very underdeveloped. There was limited options for investment, limited options for borrowing, and almost all payments occurred in cash during this period. So in short, it did not look like the future of financial innovation was going to become from China when I was there. But then I lived through the cashless revolution. And in an extremely short period of time, we went from this cash-dominated, backward, state-dominated system to one that was centered on QR code payments in super apps that combined everything you could imagine in terms of financial services, with also much of what you can do with dozens of apps in the United States from somewhere else. I'm hoping that the slides show up at some point, but I'll just keep going. So the reason that I decided that this was worth a book was that it leads to fundamental insights into really important questions that go far beyond China. So some of those include, what is the role of the dollar in the future as money goes digital and China launches a digital currency? Is the Chinese super app model something that we're going to have here in the United States in the future? Does it represent the future of finance in the United States? You might have seen this week Elon Musk tweeted that his purchase of Twitter is going to be part of creating the Everything app in the United States, which everyone who knows anything about China said sounds a lot like WeChat. So if you want to think about whether that would work and what the implications would be, the book is a perfect way to start with that. It also gives insight into how China has managed to be innovative despite being an authoritarian country under an authoritarian political system, and all of these things. I'm just going to quickly grab my printed slides because I was expecting. So the book is organized into 3 sections. The first is the beginnings of fintech in China, when the government is largely ignoring it. The second is looking at this explosion, this boom of fintech once the government decided to encourage fintech's development. And then the third stage is the stage where the government decided to do some retrenchment and do a bit of cracking down on the system. And there are really 3 characters that drive this narrative. All 3 of them are absolutely fascinating. One of them is the governor of the central bank during the period from 2002 to about 2018. That's Zhou Xiaochuan. He is an extremely pro-reform bureaucrat who also had an immense amount of political influence. And he became convinced early on that China's financial system was going to be transformed and have its potential realized through the adoption of technology, not through the government commanding the banks to modernize. So when thinking about what matters, and then the second character is Pony Ma, who is the founder of Tencent, which is China's largest gaming and social media company. And he's more of a quiet engineer type, but managed to also transform finance in his own way in competition with Jack Ma, who is the much more colorful character, founder of Alibaba, which is China's largest e-commerce company. So when I started to get into this narrative, I want you to think about the last time that you bought something online and how easy that was or how difficult that was. Probably all you had to do was type in your credit card number online and then hit pay. And you probably didn't think very much of it, including the fact that you just gave very sensitive data to a website that might charge you multiple times, or they might actually not deliver the goods to you that they promised. But you're not really too worried about that because the system in the United States, at least, really combines trust and credit alongside that, all to make a very easy, seamless system. Excellent. Now we have slides. Yes. Well, none of that existed in China when these companies were beginning their operations. So Tencent began trying to launch goods that were digital goods that only cost maybe a few dollars. And it was an excellent product, but the problem is nobody could pay for it because none of the infrastructure and trust that was required to make that transaction online that I just referred to earlier with us existed in China. People had to walk all the way to a bank branch or the post office to be able to make some kind of payment. So you can imagine no one's going to do that for a small payment. And that's because the backwards financial system in China was holding back the digital economy. And Chinese entrepreneurs thus were very different than American entrepreneurs because they had to develop more of their own type of financial system to fill in the gaps that did not exist in China, but what we take for granted in the United States. So Pony Ma here creates a virtual currency called the Q coin in 2002, and that makes making small payments easy. All you have to do is make one of these annoying payments with the traditional financial system, and now you have Q coins that you can transact freely online. And then Alipay did something similar. Initially, e-commerce was only people meeting in person and transacting in cash because there was no payment system that would work that way. But then Alipay creates an escrow system that allows that trust to be established and allows it to come up. Now, what's really interesting about this period is that the government was completely hands-off. You would think that with a state-dominated financial system, it would be very risky to launch your own payment system as a private company with no license from the government. But we see a pattern here through all sorts of financial innovations in China, that it's about 7 years from the introduction of the innovation until the government gets around to regulating it. But that leaves a gray zone. And the government's generally encouraging, but there's a lot of risk in a gray zone, especially if you're in a sensitive sector like finance and something goes wrong. So Jack Ma has to convince his team back in Hangzhou that if they get into trouble for it, he'll be the one to go to prison, not them, when they launch this thing. Another really interesting takeaway from this research was that people in Washington now think, well, all these big Chinese tech companies, they're big and important now because they received subsidies and they were beneficiaries of these big 5-year plans and all this government foresight. But actually what I found is that the government doesn't care about these companies when they're small. They were about to fail, actually, many of them, around the time the dot-com boom collapsed. But without capital from companies in the US, like Yahoo and Goldman Sachs, or others like SoftBank in Japan, we wouldn't have had these companies become successful. They really depended on foreign capital. They also depended on foreign ideas. They looked at what PayPal was doing in the United States and learned from that. And the QR codes that have become ubiquitous actually came from Japan, invented by a subsidiary of Toyota. And we find that actually protectionism is not a boon to these Chinese tech companies. In the areas where there's strong protectionism, in credit card payments where Visa and MasterCard were not allowed to enter the market, we have a backward system that doesn't work. And in the areas that are innovative, we find those are areas that were not protected. So online payments, for example, one reason Alipay exists is that they were terrified that PayPal was going to enter the market and eat their lunch. So they decided to launch and had to make it really good and internationally competitive. So that shows you the importance of competition, especially international competition, rather than state plans and subsidies. China's financial system around 2012 was ripe for disruption, but until this period, the only thing that fintech was doing was really online payments for online commerce. So it wasn't really affecting the other areas of finance where you had undersupply of financial services due to the financial repression. But at the same time, smartphones were just making it possible to have a payment device in your pocket anywhere you went. But politics had to allow that to happen and dismantle the financial repression. What I find is that's exactly what the Chinese government does in 2012. In the ending days of the pre-Xi administration, the Premier Wen Jiabao says, we have to break up the bank's monopoly and we're going to allow private capital into finance in a major way for the first time. Now, why does he do that? This is a fascinating idea. The state is about to invite private sector to disrupt itself. And the reason for that is that they began to recognize that the growth model they'd been following wasn't really working out. Debt levels were ballooning quite quickly, growth was slowing, and they realized that the big state banks were good at supporting large infrastructure investment, not so much small companies that would drive innovation in the future. New players like tech companies might be well placed to do that. So the party gives them licenses to do just about any financial service you could imagine around this period. Incumbents don't really realize the threat that they're under until June of 2013, which happens to be exactly the time when I arrived in China. I didn't realize I was flying into a financial battle zone between the state-owned financial incumbents and the tech companies. So Jack Ma launches a money market fund that offers 6% interest using a loophole versus 0.35% you would get at a bank. So in the first year of this product's existence, it grows by about the same amount as about a third of the entire growth in banking deposits. So it's a major impact on the banks. And of course, their first reaction is, let's squash this thing. Let's use our political influence to end it and allow ourselves to retain our comfortable position. But what happened is the political winds had shifted and were in support of the upstarts, and they weren't able to ban it. That forced the banks to shape up. So people across China's financial system got better interest rates on their savings, even if they didn't invest in fintech products. And the boom that resulted brings China to the global frontier of fintech innovation relatively quickly. We see on this chart to the right China is the leader in the world in terms of fintech adoption across many different dimensions, and the US is relatively low on it. People still use a lot of plastic cards, paper checks, all those things. And the secret to this was, again, competition. A hyper competition between these bundles within the super apps, where instead of having your own fiefdoms like Alibaba in e-commerce and Tencent in gaming, they were all competing along all dimensions to try and quickly digitize the economy. And this competition does what 10 years of state monopoly with UnionPay is not able to do, which is get everybody to sign up for digital payments. I think that's a lesson for central bank digital currencies, that maybe the government trying to lead retail payments innovation might not be the best way to go. One of the most interesting questions is, why did it happen there? Why didn't it happen here? We have Silicon Valley, we have all these innovative companies, there are problems with our payment system, but we haven't seen that level of transformation. One reason is that tech companies weren't able to improve as much in the United States on the existing systems as Chinese companies were able to do in China. A lot of things digitally are much more useful than cash, but if someone asks me to use a free digital payment tool, but I'm not going to get a 3% reward on my credit card, I'm probably not going to change to that. That's not going to represent a change in my life. So it was worth the risk to invite tech companies in and try to change things because they were so behind in China, maybe less than the United States, and it was worth the try for consumers. And then this chart on the right is one of my favorite illustrations of what went wrong with fintech in the United States. The whole conceptual idea for it was unbundling. You're going to take a bank, which is a bundle of all these different services, and you were going to find the one that they make fat profits on and disrupt that. And so this image is Wells Fargo's homepage, and there's the mess of fintech companies that are all doing little pieces of it. But if, from a user perspective, that is not very attractive. You have to have dozens of apps to manage your financial life across these things, trusting all of them with your bank logins. It doesn't make much sense. What China did instead was keep the bank bundle and then add the tech company bundle on top of it. And that turned out to be much more powerful and much better for them. Another is that they use a smart technology choice. They use QR codes instead of near-field communications, which is what US tech companies did. Now, QR codes are a bit insecure, there are lots of problems with it, but one advantage is that if you're Alipay, all you have to do is display a QR code on a screen and have access to the camera to scan a QR code. But if you want NFC and you're Google, you're going to ask Apple for the right to have the NFC capability in the iPhone, and they're going to tell you, no, we have our own payment system. And my favorite anecdote about this is that they said, well, maybe we'll try the SIM cards that are controlled by the telecom companies. But the telecom companies have their own system they're trying to promote, so they don't agree either. Their system is called ISIS Pay. I'm not joking. Sounds like something that would get you on the Treasury sanctions list. So the third act of this is the party control that has occurred starting really in 2017 and taken a life of its own really in 2021. This is really typical Chinese policymaking. Initially, they leave a lot of space for experimentation and development, and then as some scandals accumulate, the scale grows, they start to tighten the regulation. And then also at this time, the regulation is quite limited, in part because political influence of the big tech companies holds back needed regulation. I have this picture of Jack Ma giving his infamous October 2020 Bund Summit speech where he criticized the regulators that led to this huge crackdown on the technology sector. But what people don't realize, but if you read my book, you'll see, is that he's tried this gambit multiple times before and succeeded. In 2013, 2014, he's able to go above the head of the central bank to neuter payment security regulations that would hold back QR code payments. And that's something that policymakers are really uncomfortable with. At the same time, the global backlash against large technology companies and concerns about their effect on competition and privacy led some of the advocates of allowing tech in to have second thoughts. And meanwhile, the people below, the Politburo Standing Committee of the Communist Party, especially Xi Jinping there in the middle, decided to move things towards more of a statist direction. And of course, that is going to conflict with a disruptive model of private companies. The tension that China had to deal with was retaining dynamism while reining in some of the excess in this system. In this process, they had some really hard-earned lessons that I think are important for us to pay attention to as we think about how to develop finance in the US and elsewhere. One is that it's really hard to tell ex ante what is a true durable innovation. There are going to be failed innovations. And in the financial sector, failed innovations are much more costly than in other sectors because you don't just have VC investors and startup employees losing out. you have regular people losing their savings. And that's what we had with peer-to-peer lending and many failed initial coin offerings. China ended up putting the genie in the bottle, but at a cost that democracies could not stomach. So I stopped advancing the slides, but there's a picture here on the right of a set of buses in Beijing, which are creating an involuntary tour of the city for people who want to protest the collapse of these peer-to-peer lending companies, which they assumed were supported by the government. And they're getting bussed off to black jails and deported back to their home country. That's what was needed to maintain social stability after some of these collapses, and that's what would not work in the United States or other places. So the rest of the world can learn from this experience and take the things that worked in China and not do the things that did not work in China. So then next, excellent, it's working, is international expansion, because this is not just a China story. These companies have immense amount of capital, users, and expertise they want to take around the world. But one of the things I found is that surprisingly, they had very little success outside of China. It's very easy to convince merchants to accept Alipay payments, for example, when Chinese tourists are moving around the world. And one reason for it, one of the payment providers in Europe said it's like offering a car without air conditioning if you don't allow Alipay to work. But they have failed so far to get they have failed so far to obtain users abroad. And in part, that's because they're not localizing very well to the domestic market. The super app model is hard to just transplant. You know, we've seen that it was a hard-earned many years of providing payments before they started to become financial giants. But they've inspired copycats around the world. What's happened in terms of competition in third markets, if you look at India, it's one of the best examples. WeChat made a major play in there and failed because a US company, WhatsApp, ended up eating their lunch. And it did so not with a super app, but with a very slimmed down chat app that worked really well on local people's phones and was well adapted. And then that provided the basis now for a potential new super app from Mark Zuckerberg, which WhatsApp could be, or the Libra idea was. So even if the companies that have tried to expand Chinese fintech model abroad haven't really worked out so far from China, in part because of national security concerns in countries that say, sure, you can serve Chinese tourists, but we don't want you collecting sensitive data on our citizens. But their ideas are spreading. And Silicon Valley still aims to build global super apps modeled on the Chinese. One of the most hot topics in Washington now is the dollar threatened by the rise of China's central bank digital currency. I think it's more of a story of a shift away from the sources of innovation in finance in China from the private sector, as it's become much more heavily regulated, to the public sector. But so far, that story hasn't worked out very well for the public sector innovation in China. It hasn't really innovated because you have too little competition. The central bank in China, the PBOC, has the most advanced central bank digital currency pilot of any major economy. 250 million people have used an ECNY wallet, but there's no clear first mover advantage in the international space, I found in an academic article I published last year. And there are many nascent threats to the US dollar from, for example, many countries deciding to try and transact directly between their currencies instead of using the US dollar, but those are still very nascent, along with those systems that would connect central bank digital currency to another central bank digital currency. So I don't find that the dollar is on the cusp of disruption, but if you look at this chart on the right, the blue line is the cost in the United States in percentage to send $200 across borders for remittances, and you see that's been a pretty stagnant 6%. So although we've had all sorts of advances in technology, the cost of using the US dollar in international transactions hasn't really gone down. And the best way to defend the dollar is to improve these systems, make them cheaper, faster, more efficient, not necessarily to launch a central bank digital currency. One reason China is down to do this much earlier than we are is that they're not as concerned about the fact that the government is going to have a ledger of every single transaction and the privacy implications there. The government now has a very different vision for the future of fintech than what existed up until now. It wants the state digital currency as the base layer for the system instead of a private digital currencies and private super apps. They want the walled gardens of the monopolists to open up and to share that data with small startups. Of course, the devil's in the details. That's really hard to do without violating privacy. Another is they want to split up these super apps, maybe not in terms of function, but at least on the back end, provide firewalls to reduce conflicts of interest. There's much more consumer choice for data protection. You'll notice that some of these, like this one, would be quite welcome in the United States and other countries as well. This is not just a statist, negative agenda that's bad for civil liberties. Some of it could actually be quite good if it works, and we have to see whether they're able to implement that. There's less tolerance for risk in finance. Of course, that's going to mean less innovation. And no debt-fueled overconsumption. They don't want to become the United States, where everyone can get credit super easily and many people overborrow. And finally, the tech firms are servers of state development goals instead of their own interests, which is also a recipe for less innovation. To conclude, before I get into the final conclusions, I want to show the power and peril of fintech through its role in COVID. So when China first had the outbreak of the pandemic, they locked everybody down. And one of the key questions was, how can we ease this lockdown to let the low-risk people out, but still not have the virus go back out of control? And one of the things they found to do that was Alipay, which collaborated with the government of Hangzhou to create an algorithm that would determine who gets a green code, which means that you're able to go around and do your shopping and live again, or you're in one of these refined quarantine, separate quarantine facilities if you get a red code. And if you think about it, this is extraordinary. The state has farmed out to a private company the algorithm that determines whether 1 billion people are able to leave their house or not. That's just extraordinary. One of the things they discovered in this is that many people actually don't have Alipay and didn't have the ability to have these codes. So many of the elderly and the poor were left behind once you completely move out of cash and you only have these super apps. And then you have this ubiquitous app that then becomes a single locus of control. Inside the Alipay health code, there was this wonderfully named command, which is report info and location to police. And now people living in China, anywhere they go, they have to scan one of these codes, and it tells the police exactly where they are and exactly their movements. That is an absolute nightmare for civil liberties in the future, and something that maybe not just the Chinese government might like to have to keep tabs on its citizens. Another is all this bundling. If you look at WeChat, if you write something that's politically sensitive on WeChat, you might get locked out of your account. Now, you might be willing to do that if it's just your chat account, but what if you lose access to your savings and investments and your business as well? That becomes a really scary, not only concentration of power in WeChat, but a method for self-censorship. So to conclude, China's cashless revolution has offered great promise. It brought incredible financial freedom, convenience, and inclusion to many Chinese people, but also great danger. And you see that often the promise begins and then slowly turns into a danger when it's in different hands, say a different political system than existed, or different political winds now than in 2013 when it began. The US has many advantages in its tech companies and with the dollar internationally, but cannot afford to just remain complacent. We have to keep improving and innovating our system, not just say what we have is good enough. The US can find a balance between the decentralized vision of cryptocurrencies and the fully centralized version of China. We can find a sweet spot that works for our vision of where the private sector and public sector should be. And China is undisputedly the pioneer in fintech and how to regulate it, and the technology sector now. So we can learn a great deal from its mistakes and its victories, and if you read my book, you'll learn a lot from it. Thank you.
I don't think I would have dared say, if you read my book, you'll learn a lot. It's actually a true statement. It's evolution, by the way. Martin, can we go back to your beginning? How do you see the sort of free-handed way you describe the initial development of fintech in the context of the vast literature of China's development model? Is this something that is unique to fintech because it fell in the realm of the PBOC, or was it something very parallel to what was going on in other fields? For students of Chinese political economy, how do you think about this?
I think about it as very consistent with the way that they've developed other areas, but you have to disaggregate what kind of sector. So in the tech sector, my little mental model of it is there weren't really these incumbents that were state-owned that were operating. So there was a lot of freedom there because they didn't have an existing regulatory regime they would have to waive. They just had to create a new one. So you have regulatory inertia, you have to figure out what approach to take, debate, go through multiple levels of bureaucracy and get that figured out. So I think we see sort of difference between different sides, but then looking at fintech in general, it gives you a very consistent picture with what, for example, Yuan Ang has called, directed improvisation, where the government gives sort of parameters for what kind of experimentation is okay and provides a general message, and then lets things develop in that way, and then gradually begins to create market supporting institutions when that's necessary. So it's quite consistent.
So as we look at the US, I'll use the verb lurching into its own forms of industrial policy. It's always had some, but new initiatives and concern about competing with China in particular areas. Is this a model that the US regulators or innovation incentivizers can follow, or is there just too much history in the US? You can't clean it up and restart?
I think that there are ways to take some of the lessons, not all, and make it work. And one of the lessons from the Chinese experience is when there was a regulator that had a responsibility for a sector and was watching it, even if they were giving it space, they knew how big it was, they knew what activities were going on, they were able to regulate largely in time and prevent something like a really dangerous bubble from developing. But in areas like peer-to-peer lending, where there was nobody responsible for it and they treated it like a hot potato, that was an area that ended up blowing up. So the lesson I would take is have somebody responsible for this sector and watching it. But I really like the idea of sandboxes, which have been played around within the fintech space but never to the extent in China. One of the senior regulators in China in one of our meetings once said, China's not a sandbox, it's a sand house. Actually, it's a whole beach that people can play on. And I found that quite funny. So we probably wouldn't want to go that far, but there are ways within a rule of law system that you can create limited exemptions that allow this experimentation to thrive.
You mentioned, as you were giving that response, the things that blew up along the way, like P2P lending. How much, so there is a whole other thread, and you of course deal with this in the book, to China's fintech revolution, that there were these recurring bouts of financial instability in China. How much do you see the fintech as contributing to financial instability in China, being a reflection of just the inherent instabilities? Are there, again, general lessons for others in the world, not just the US, about fintech and financial stability?
Sure. So fintech was really like an accelerant to many of the existing problems in the financial system. The area where they created the most risk for China was around 2015 with the stock market boom, because all these online brokers managed to get people to get margin loans and throw their money into the stock market at extremely high leverage, and the government wasn't really tracking it. And that threw a lot of accelerant on an already dangerous situation. But what I see over and over again is that the system is trying, and the fintech system is trying to provide more transparency and be more clear, but China's system is not really conducive to a lot of this transparency. And one of the things they struggle with is that Chinese consumers want a free lunch. They want to get a higher interest rate, and they don't want to accept that there's any risk. So anytime they try to be transparent about the risks and say, hey, actually, the return on this product is going to be a little volatile, people flee it and go right to the Ponzi scheme that's offering them the highest. And that kind of behavior also then accentuates the instability, but it's a pre-existing problem that China's had moral hazard for this long time. And these are beneficiaries of it that create unfortunate economic incentives.
Continuing in sort of your first period of your description, this amazing burst in activity, in ability of normal people to pay for things and get access. I'll ask you a question you're familiar with from older IT literature. Where is this in the GDP data? Obviously this is much better for a lot of people, a lot of vendors, but do you feel that Chinese growth would have slowed down even more absent fintech? I mean, how big a deal was this for the economy?
I think it was a really big deal for the economy, especially when you consider that, all of the transactions that were enabled through these e-commerce systems and the whole digital economy that developed around Tencent, which shows up in its sales to video games and subscription revenue, all of these things. I don't think it's hidden somewhere. It was absolutely crucial to the rise of the consumer technology sector, and that obviously played a major role in transforming a lot of the economy, and also bringing a diffusion of technology outside of the main capitals, because once they saturated the Beijing and Shanghai with these payment systems, they then started to expand and try to get rural areas signed up to this. So in an area where you would have an uncompetitive single monopolist distributor of something like refrigerators, now someone can just buy it online. And that created price competition and a whole variety of new options for consumption for people, and also new opportunities for employment that I think were quite positive for its economy. I haven't seen a convincing estimate in terms of a point number, but I would guess it would be quite high.
You keep hammering, and I think rightly, on this issue of competition. You mentioned how MasterCard and Visa very notably have been excluded from Chinese markets even after WTO decisions. At the same time, you mentioned how things like WhatsApp didn't extend into export dominance, didn't extend it to new markets abroad. So could you say a little more about where you see, again, how much is this fintech specific thing versus a general thing for China that, yes, they can protect their own market, but that doesn't necessarily make them competitive abroad, or it might even make them less competitive abroad. Say a little more about that dynamic.
Yeah, it's a really complex dynamic, and maybe the most interesting counterexample to that is TikTok, which is the first real Chinese app, service app to be successful. The companies that are creating refrigerators and computers and surveillance cameras, for example, that's hard technology, that's assembly and putting together things. That has been quite successful. That's not really protected, right? The manufacturing area is very private sector dominated and has room for foreign players. And there they've been able to learn and reach the global frontier. But on these sectors, I think one area that makes it a bit of an exception from the rest of China's economy is the fact that finance is just so sensitive. So it's all this permissive regulatory environment and support that they had in China, all of the huge user base that they had already accumulated that allowed them to build a flywheel for this two-sided payments market, all of that didn't apply abroad. And in many other sectors of the economy, that just doesn't really matter so much. They're one-sided markets where you're simply competing on price and product, and you're not really going to be concerned about the central bank saying, we're not going to give you a license to operate because we don't want you sending the data back to China.
I'm going to pose two more questions and then turn to the audience of Martin's friends, fans, and colleagues. So first one is essentially jumping to your Act 3. There is the dramatic instance that happened in real life of, at the Bund Summit, Jack Ma deciding to complain loudly about the regulators. And was it Wang Qishan came up shortly thereafter to say, now you point out important context that Ma had played that game, made those movements before, but that did set off a sense among a lot of market observers, a lot of people that, okay, China's golden goose of innovation is getting at least partially cooked. You wrote a very provocative blog, I believe it was, for the Peterson Institute around that time saying, no, this is actually sort of reflecting some longer term developments. Now that we're roughly 2 years, I think, since that moment, how do you see the encouragement versus stomping on the Chinese tech sector?
I think it's a bit in stasis now. So the book, obviously, there's an end to when you can make revisions, and there's quite a gap between that and now. But reading the conclusion, I felt quite good about it, because this was just the beginning of this wave of regulation that's continued. And one of the things I warned about is that it's probably going to go too far. because of the way that China's political system has shifted, there's less ability to argue against a dominant political line. And the Politburo's line was prevent the disorderly expansion of capital, build anti-monopoly work. And in all of these areas, there was very little precedent for data protection. Competition policy pretty much didn't apply to big tech companies until 2020. There's like not a single case you can find against Alibaba or Tencent, despite all of the companies they were buying up and their dominant position. So there was a lot of justifiable reason, but then to do this and preparation at the regulators, so a lot of what they're doing is well thought through, but when it's all hitting you at once in a wave, the level of uncertainty and new compliance costs you deal with is just overwhelming. So I think they hope that when this new regime is established and the uncertainty declines, they might be able to have more innovation from these firms. But I'm not seeing it yet. And as I presented about a week ago here, if you look at the venture capital numbers in China, they hope that cracking down on the big guys is going to create all this space for these, new startups that are going to be super innovative. And we're seeing the worst VC quarter in Q2 of 8 years in China. So we're not seeing this, funding going into all these new companies that could be the new round of innovation.
Thank you. My last question was, you eventually discussed in your presentation and in your book the e-yuan, the Chinese central bank digital currency. Could you say a bit more about why you think that belongs in this story? I mean, in a sense, yeah, it's electronic, it's payments, okay. In another sense, it doesn't seem to have literally taken any market share away from the kinds of companies you were talking about in fintech, and it's obviously not a corporate thing. So say a bit more about why you think the CBDC fits under this same heading and why it's important.
Sure. So it kind of goes back to when the Chinese government watches Bitcoin taking off in China in 2013. They get really scared by this because it could really, unlike these other things which you can kind of regulate, Bitcoin is outside their control. It's decentralized. It's stateless. And Chinese people like it in part for that reason, because they can get their money outside the grip of the state. So they come down really hard on cryptocurrency, but at the same time, they recognize that there's some potential in this new technology, but they don't necessarily trust the private sector to be the one to develop it. So if you think about, what the next era of fintech innovation is going to be, a lot of it's going to be driven by how the central bank designs smart contracts. And the way I think about it is the base layer of payments is going to be this system. And it's also designed to be built in to provide different privacy protections than currently the way that people use Alipay. So it's going to constrain, as a sort of secondary layer of regulation, the private companies, and they might end up being just kind of fronts, where you use Alipay, but what you're actually transacting is the ECNY. And all the rules about how that works and a lot of the acquiring environment about how you pay is going to be increasingly decided by the state and how they design the ECNY system instead of how private companies decide to do. And they're making it legal tender, so everyone has to accept it, unlike Ali. So instead of the system of economic inducements that Ali and Tencent used to build this revolution in the first place, you now have government fiat. You will accept this currency.
Thank you for explaining. Let me now turn to our audience. If Jessica has a traveling mic for anybody in the front row, please.
I'm Rory McFarker from MasterCard. So thank you very much, Martin, for such a compelling presentation. And I very much look forward to reading the completed draft of your book. Question building on Adam's last question. A lot of people in Washington are making the argument that the United States needs to adopt a central bank digital currency precisely because otherwise we will fall behind China, which already has one. You mentioned in passing in your presentation that there isn't a first mover advantage in fintech, but could you address frontally that statement that is frequently heard?
Sure. So I think a lot of the worry is about this foreign idea, this central bank digital currency. But one of the problems is that it's not really clear exactly what a central bank digital currency is. It can be many different things to different people. So to some people, it's electronic cash. That doesn't sound very threatening to the US dollar. But in another, it's central banks connecting directly on a distributed ledger system based on blockchain technology to more efficiently, they hope, move money directly between central banks with no need for all the US financial infrastructure in New York and all the intermediaries and all that. So it's a lot of different things, and because they don't really understand it and China's ahead in it, it looks like a threat. Now the problem is we don't actually know how well this is going to work. All of these trials are in a very early stage, and I think what we're finding in a lot of experiments in the financial system today is that without calling it a CBDC, which is often just a distinction without a difference, because the money that's transacted in dollars cross-border is almost all digital already. It's digital already, and it's already kind of central bank money, but it's banks that are moving it in these systems. It's reserves, it's central bank backstopped payment systems. So whether it's a CBDC or not isn't really the important thing. So I'm arguing instead of saying China's advanced in this thing, therefore we have to have it, we can say, what's the path of technology we want to take that's going to improve our financial system and the cross-border elements of payments, and can we improve upon that without being so focused on whether it has this 4-letter acronym attached to it?
Great. We have time for one last question. Please, if you give the microphone.
Thank you. Donghe from the IMF. Martin, congratulations on the publication of the book. My question is really on contestability of technology-driven markets. So it's been very hard to regulate the big techs. But the story of China showed that it can happen very quickly. For example, Alipay was the first mover, then WeChat Pay using red packets money that basically led to a duopoly kind of situation within 5 years' time. Now, you mentioned that Alipay and others failed in other countries, but there were copycats everywhere. So how do you think about, from China's experience, about contestability in these technology-driven markets? That's really a key question for public policy. I don't think we have a very good answer there.
Yeah, I think it's a crucial question internationally and also in China, because how much you need anti-monopoly stuff in China depends on how contestable these markets are. You probably saw Huang Yiping put out a piece showing actually many of these markets are more contestable than we thought. So sometimes you have an overreaction where you say these bundles are so strong that no one can possibly compete with them. And then what we find is that there's actually new innovation that then competes with them. Just look at Facebook in the United States versus TikTok. Something that looked relatively unassailable is now really, really under threat. So my sense is that they're much more contestable than we think, but that countries look at China's system and they say, we want the same thing, but we don't want China to bring it here. We want to develop our financial system quickly, but we want the competition. So they look at it and say, how can we have the same advantages without it becoming a duopoly? And they're tinkering with their regulatory system to do the protectionism that China did, saying, no foreigners allowed, but then allowing there to be domestic competition to make it work. And that's going to be more likely to work in larger markets where there's enough scale to support multiple players.
Great. Thank you all today around the world and here in Washington for joining us for the launch of the new book by Martin Chorzempa, The Cashless Revolution, available using China e-Bitcoins from Public Affairs Publisher and from all good bookstores, virtual and real. Martin, thank you and congratulations.
Thank you.
Wonderful job.